Well, it's good to be here this morning, and it is really good to be in your presence. Been looking forward to this for well over a year. I think Rusty asked me almost 2 years ago if I'd be willing to come and be a part of this and to speak on this subject of building a team. I want to say, on behalf of myself, my wife Lacey, and my children, we're thankful for the hospitality, and it's an exciting time for the Lord's church. As I've traveled from place to place, I see God's people thriving and growing, and a lot of focus on spiritual things. I look out in the audience today, see a lot of young people, which is very encouraging, exciting. And as we go through this week, I hope the things that I have to share will be an encouragement to you. I hope that you will be encouraged. And I want us to consider Nehemiah as kind of the example we're going to go back to throughout the week. Nehemiah is an interesting character and an interesting story, and we're going to get into that in just a moment. But I want to kind of lay out expectations for the week. Building a team is a complex subject. There's a lot of opinions that can be brought in. There's a lot of concepts and processes and a lot of things that can go in that aren't necessarily chapter and verse. So as we go through this week, we're going to talk about some high-level concepts. We're going to talk about concepts related to leadership, teamwork, ways that we should work with one another. What do we do when there's conflict? What do we do when we are facing challenges, both internal struggles or external struggles? How do we handle those things? But also, I want you to know that this series of lessons is adaptable. And what I mean by that is this. As an evangelist, a lot of times people ask an evangelist to come in, and the evangelist comes in with a set things that they are going to cover. I want to tell you there is some flexibility in what we're going to cover this week. Because as we have conversations and you have ideas and concepts, I want to work those into the things that we're doing and talking about. So don't hesitate to bring things to my attention and say, hey, this is an area I think our congregation could grow in, or area of focus that we'd like to spend time in. And so I will start today talking about Nehemiah, laying some of the foundation today. Tomorrow's lesson is set on building the team, setting the team. But beyond that, we've got some flexibility. And so I'm encouraging you to talk to me at lunch. Text me, get my number, say, hey, these are some things we would like to discuss. And we'll be happy to try to incorporate those in. Now, Nehemiah, just as a little bit of a history, Nehemiah is an interesting individual because he comes at a time when the Jewish people had been scattered. Under the Babylonian Empire, Judah was destroyed, Solomon's temple was destroyed, and people were dispersed. And Nehemiah comes about 71 years after the temple was rebuilt, and about 140 years from the destruction of Solomon's temple. Now, we're going to look at this verse as being kind of the core verse that we're going to consider throughout the week. In Nehemiah chapter 4 and verse 6 it says, so we built the wall, and all the wall was joined together to half its height, for the people had a mind to work. And this week we're going to talk about work. We're going to talk about what it takes to work for the Lord's church and how we can grow and build brick by brick. So who was Nehemiah? Well, Nehemiah was a couple of things. To classify Nehemiah, you could say he was a man of some preeminence, of some authority. He had risen within the ranks to become the cupbearer to the king of Persia. Now, what was a cupbearer? A cupbearer was not just the guy that brought him the cup, but he was literally the person whose sole job was to taste the wine before it was handed to the king to see if it was poison or not. If I was going to ask someone to be my cupbearer, there would be a whole lot of trust both ways, right? That person had to really love me or have a strong desire to serve me to be willing to take that kind of risk. Well, this is who Nehemiah was. He was a man who took on that task and that role as a cupbearer. And with that, had access to the king of Persia, and he had an opportunity to speak to the king from time to time. Another thing that's important about Nehemiah is he was a Jew. He was a descendant of Abraham. He was an heir according to the promise. And so he was not only a child of a descendant of Abraham, but he was also in a great position in Persia. Now, Nehemiah received some bad news. And in Nehemiah chapter 1, verses 3 and 4, he received news about the destruction and the current state of the wall around Jerusalem. In Nehemiah chapter 1, verse 3, it says, "And they said to me, the remnant there in the province who had survived the exile is in great trouble and shame. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down and its gates are destroyed by fire. As soon as I heard these words, I sat down and wept and mourned for days. And I continued fasting and praying before the God of heaven." I want us to understand something about Nehemiah here. Nehemiah was a person who had great concern for the broken. He mourned and wept the state of the walls around Jerusalem. He had a heart for the broken. And as we go through this week, I want you to examine your heart. Do you have a heart for the broken? Do you have a care and a concern for those things that are not right in the sight of God? Nehemiah did. He had great concern. It says that he wept and he mourned. When is the last time we have wept and mourned over the state of the world we live in? How often have we wept for those who have abandoned the faith and have left the church? How often have we mourned them? I can tell you this is a sensitive subject. Not very long ago, a dear brother of mine in the church, a man who I spent almost every week going to lunch with, someone whose family had integrated into our family's life, and they decided over a dispute to leave the church. And I mourned that relationship. This last week we had our summer revival. We had 101 children, 18 and under, attend that week. On average, 80 to 85 per day were there. But his kids weren't there. And I mourned that. Do we mourn and weep for those things that are broken? You know, Nehemiah did, but he didn't just stay in that somber state. He didn't just weep and mourn and say, oh, well, but he then turned his attention to God. In Nehemiah chapter 1, starting in verse 5, it says, "And I said, O Lord God of heaven, the great and awesome God who keeps covenant and steadfast love with those who love him and keep his commandments, let your ear be attentive and your eyes open to hear the prayer of your servant that I now pray before you day and night for the people of Israel, your servants, confessing the sins of the people of Israel, which have sinned against you. Even I and my father's house have sinned." Skipping to verse 11, "O Lord, let your ear be attentive to the prayer of your servant and to the prayer of your servants who delight to fear your name, and give success to your servant today, and grant him mercy in the sight of this man." Here Nehemiah goes before God because he recognizes he can't just do nothing. He's got to act. But before he has the courage to act, he's got to turn to God and ask for God's blessing on the success of this endeavor. And that's what he does. He prays with confidence. We've got to pray with confidence when it comes to the work that's going to happen this week and in the weeks to come here in Tulsa. We've got to pray with confidence that the Lord will provide success to his people who turn to him and obey his instructions. But you know, Nehemiah also needed confidence to go before a king and to ask for a very specific request. As mentioned, he was a cupbearer. He had access to the king, but it wasn't like he could just go up and ask for things. This was the king of Persia, a great conqueror. Yet he went to the king, and he petitioned the king, having confidently prayed and fasted before the Lord. And he went and requested the king. And as he went before the king says he looked at me and he looked sad. And he said, "Why are you sad?" Says Nehemiah, if you haven't read it yet, I encourage you to read the book this week. But Nehemiah is speaking from the first person. So he's talking about it from his perspective as he's writing. And he says that he had never seen me sad before. So evidently Nehemiah was not just a gloom individual who just moped around life. There was something about his presence that day that drew attention to his sorrow and to what he was dealing with internally. But Nehemiah also had the confidence because he prayed to God. And through that prayer of confidence, he requested the king. In Nehemiah chapter 2, verse 5, it says, "And I said to the king, if it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in your sight, that you send me to Judah, to the city of my father's grave, that I might rebuild it." He showed tremendous courage in this act. asking to leave his post, a post of that it's not like you go call a temp agency to fill, right? This was the cupbearer of the king. This needed to be someone of great loyalty, someone who was willing to take the poison in the place of the king. Yet he went and he said, if it's favorable to you, let me go and rebuild it. It meant that much to Nehemiah. He had such great care and concern and such confidence through faith. He went and he asked. How often do we stop short of asking? How often do we weep and we have concern and even prayerful consideration, but we don't go and act? We hope someone else acts. We hope someone else will lead the charge in the work of this congregation, but do we act? You see, Nehemiah wasn't going to wait for someone else to see the distress of the people. He acted. And he went and requested. And not only did the king show favor to Nehemiah, not only did he grant him access, but he provided him with two things of great value. One, he gave him a letter that gave him safe passage in the authority to go to Judah and to serve there. Second, he gave him access to timber. And that's no small thing. He gave him access to the king's timber to use to reconstruct the wall. Two things that showed a great love and care for Nehemiah the servant. Now Nehemiah, as he travels and he gets to Judah, the first thing he does is he inspects the wall. He goes to see the condition of the wall. He wants to see if it's something that's salvageable, if it has too much rubble to be, or the rubble that must be removed, or is it completely flattened state, or what is the state of this wall. He had to go and see it for himself and not just rely on the testimony of others. He needed to go see it for himself. And it says in verse 11, so I went to Jerusalem and was there 3 days. Then I rose in the night, I and a few men with me, and I told no one what my God had put in my heart to do for Jerusalem. There was no animal with me but the one on which I rode. I went out by night by the valley gate to the dragon spring and to the dung gate, and I inspected the walls of Jerusalem that were broken down and its gates that had been destroyed by fire. Then I went to the fountain gate and to the king's pool, but there was no room for the animal that was under me to pass. Then I went up in the night by the valley and inspected the wall, and I turned back and entered by the valley gate, and so returned. You know, this is an interesting group of passages, and for you and me, this may not mean a lot, but to those that would have been reading this record, they would have known. All of those gates, all of those pools, all of those things were of great significance to those people. You know, you might say you look at a map and you have a map of Tulsa and you know where this building is or where that overpass is or where that Taco Bueno is. You know, I need that map, by the way, before I leave. Where's the Taco Bueno? Lacey wants to know where the Brahms are. But you know, we have these maps and we have these landmarks and we can identify and we can know those things. And you're going to know in your congregation things that I can't know. Not being here, not working among you. But if we're going to have a true and honest evaluation of the work that's happening here and the team that's being built here, to have a true and honest evaluation is going to require those that know the landmarks, that are going to know what's happening, to contribute to the conversation so that it's not one-sided. It's not me telling you what you need to do, but it's me helping steer and guide the conversation. And Nehemiah inspected the walls. He needed to see the state in which they were in. But he also needed help. You know, Nehemiah was also a committed leader. You know, he was all in on this situation. A little bit later in the story in Nehemiah chapter 5, and I'm going out of order a little bit because I want to focus on his leadership skills for a second. But Nehemiah chapter 5, there was some conflict. And part of the conflict resolved income discrepancies amongst those people that were there working. But I want us to understand what Nehemiah's commitment to this cause was. He left a good position, albeit could have been poisoned to death, but he left a pretty decent position to go to a foreign place, a place that was of his heritage, but not a place that was his home. That wasn't where he lived. But not only that, he was appointed governor of that place, given a more permanent status to be over Judah in Jerusalem. But not only did he go do that, but he did not make wealth on that situation. Let's read what's said here. Moreover, the time that I was appointed to be the governor in the land of Judah, from the 20th year to the 32nd year of Artaxerxes the king, 12 years, neither I nor my brothers ate the food allowance of the governor. The former governors who were before me laid heavy burdens on the people and took from them for their daily ration 40 shekels of silver. Even their servants lorded over the people, but I did not do so because of the fear of God. A couple of things I want us to notice. He had every right to demand the shekel. He had every right to demand the revenue or the income or the wealth out of this situation. He was appointed by the king of Persia. He had the right. He had the right to lord over them. He had the authority. He had a letter that gave him that authority, yet out of his own humility and his love for God and love for the people, he chose not that. I think about Paul and Paul's commitment to the cause of Christ when he says, I have robbed others to serve you. Because he wasn't willing to take from their situation because of the desperation of their situation. And here Nehemiah is in the same boat. He was a leader who was committed even to his own detriment. So when we consider leadership in this congregation, we need to consider those to be leaders who are not self-serving, but are committed, that are all in, that are willing to sacrifice for the cause of Christ. Nehemiah, having now presented this opportunity and as demonstrated by his willing to leave Persia and to go and to serve in this role and to not take or to demand from the people, he had an opportunity of influence to speak to them in that respectful way. In Nehemiah chapter 2, verse 17, he says, Then I said to them, You see the trouble we are in, how Jerusalem lies in ruins with its gates burned. Come, let us build the wall of Jerusalem that we may no longer suffer derision. And I told them of the hand of my God that had been upon me for good, and also for the words that the king had spoken to me. Here Nehemiah is standing, he's casting a vision. He says, we need to do something here. See the walls? Do you see how they're in trouble? You see how we have an opportunity to rebuild, how the king has given us timber, how God is with us and supporting us in this endeavor. And he casts a vision. He says, this is what we need to do. But you know, you can cast a vision, but if no one follows, you're just taking a walk, right? That's what they say. A leader that has no one following is just taking a walk. You see, Nehemiah was in that situation. He had this plan. He had a concern. He wept over it. He mourned over it. He fasted over it. He prayed over it. He petitioned. He did all of these things to get to this point. But if he couldn't sell it, and the people didn't believe it, and the people didn't want to do it, it had all been for nothing. So let's see the response of the people. It says, and they said, let us rise up and build. So they strengthened their hands for the good work. You see, these people were ready to answer the call. This morning, are you ready to answer the call? Are you ready to stand up and shout, let us rise up and build? Are you going to be the teammate that is committed to the cause, that's willing to suffer, willing to give up time, talent, and resources to other endeavors or other obligations and commit them to the work of the Lord? You see, these people were committed. He asked for help, and they were committed. Who were these people? Who was the team that answered the call? You know, a lot of times we look at our society, and in different places, you've got different demographics. You've got different, nationalities, races, economic status. Harlingen's an interesting place. Harlingen, when we moved there many years ago, it was primarily Anglo, white, English-speaking. But through the course of time, we have people that are African American. We have people that are of Asian descent, Native American descent. We have a large Hispanic population that's part of our congregation. We have multiple languages. When Dustin and Hannah were still living in Harlingen, they were part of the group that made a commitment, like, hey, we're going to sing Spanish songs. Hey, we're going to do these things to help incorporate this demographic. And that led to a huge growth in our congregation, embracing the multiculturalistic nature of our community. We have people that had wealth. We have people that have no wealth. We have people that work hard and with their hands, people that work that are white-collar workers. We have a great different variety and demographic in our congregation. I'm sure y'all do as well. And it was no different for Nehemiah. You see, what's interesting about the story of Nehemiah is when he put out the call, he wasn't really discriminate in any way. He was like, anyone that's of the remnant of Judah, come and help. Who's here? Who's around? And they answered the call. And it wasn't just one class of people. It wasn't just one group of people, but they all answered. And it's interesting, if you were to read Nehemiah chapter 3, all the different classifications and all the different demographics that are brought up. And these aren't even all of them that I put on the list. But we had people that had religious roles. We had the high priest was out there helping build a gate. We had other priests. We had the Levites. We had the temple servants. We had rulers. We had people that were of high nobility that were out working, laboring to reconstruct the wall. Nobles. It even mentions goldsmiths, perfumers, merchants, general laborers, gatekeepers. There's a mention of a man with his daughters. There is a variety of people that were all out working, and those are the people that answer the call. So if you were to say, I get it, but it's a young man's game. Guess what? They had old people out there working too. They say, well, I get it. I mean, but it's got to have someone that can speak publicly. They had people that couldn't speak publicly. They had people of all walks, all attitudes and lifestyles. And you know what's interesting about this when they were building? If you go through Nehemiah 3, it doesn't say, well, some were building over there and some were building over there. And everybody's rogue. Everybody's doing their own thing. They're all finding a hole in the wall and patching. No. It says they did this, and next to them, they did this. And next to them, they did this. And besides them, they did this. And you hear this, and you have this visual of this wall being constructed with organization and with effort. And they were next to each other, working shoulder to shoulder all the way around this wall. No one was off road doing their own thing. They were organized. And they were working together to complete this wall, side by side. Nehemiah 4 verse 6, as they were continuing to build, it says, so we built the wall, and all the wall was joined together to half its height, for the people had a mind to work. Now again, there's a reason why we're going to be looking at this verse so much this week. It starts with a mental attitude of commitment to the Lord. You want to be a part of a team? Well, being a part of a team means you're willing to lend in, to lean in, to have a mind to do the things that are necessary to fulfill the goal and mission. And in this case, the goal and the mission was to rebuild the wall around Jerusalem. But it took a people that had a mind to work. Not those that were passive. Those that would show up and look at the wall being built. That's not what was needed. They needed people actively working and contributing to its success. Now, they had their conflict. They were no different than our congregations might be today. They had conflict. They had issues. They had doubters. Here we read about a noble who would not stoop to serve their Lord. They sent their servants, but this particular noble wouldn't get off their horse. And we see that sometimes. We have those conflicts where it's good enough for someone else to do the work, but I'm not going to do it myself. Well, we need to all get in and be involved. They had conflicts over that. They had conflicts over the issues of their wealth and their income situation and disparities around that. It says in Nehemiah 5, starting verse 1, now there arose a great outcry of the people and their wives against their Jewish brothers, for there were those who said, with our sons and our daughters we are many, so let us get grain that we may eat and keep alive. There were also those who said, We are mortgaging our fields, our vineyards, and our houses to get grain because of the famine. And there were those who said, we have borrowed money for the king's tax on our fields and our vineyards. And it goes on to talk about the situation they were in. They didn't have time to go make money because they were focused on this effort. But they still had to pay their taxes. They still had to feed their family. So they were going to some of the Jewish people that were around, and they were lending them money, but with interest. They were taking advantage of that situation. Nehemiah wasn't happy. And he told them that was going to stop. And he stopped and he said, you're not going to charge a usury fee on top of their needs. And he made it so that he could help them resolve that internal conflict. But they had that conflict. They weren't free from any conflict internal. They also had external conflict. In Nehemiah chapter 2, verse 10, two individuals who will come back later. It says, but when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Amorite servant heard this, it displeased them greatly that someone had come to seek the welfare of the people of Israel. Now this is chapter 2, and this is just a quick little note in the story when they say, oh, they're displeased. This is before Nehemiah actually rallied the people. He hadn't even inspected the wall yet when this is stated. But already there were those that were ready to murmur and complain and cause problems. And they were not of the household of Israel. They were not descendants of Abraham. These were people from other nations who were of high authority in other areas that were speaking in on this situation and causing conflict. But you know, their words turned into action. In Nehemiah chapter 4, starting verse 7, it says, but when Sanballat and Tobiah and the Arabs, the Amorites and the Ashdodites and the heard that they were repairing the walls of Jerusalem, that repairing of the walls of Jerusalem was going forward, and that the breaches were beginning to be closed, they were very angry. And they all plotted together to come and fight against Jerusalem and to cause confusion in it. They were ready to start a war. They did not like that the children of Israel were putting the wall back together. And this external conflict was coming down on Nehemiah. The pressure of that impending battle was coming down upon Nehemiah. But Nehemiah didn't flinch. You see, Nehemiah was a good leader, a leader who could rally the people to work together. And a very impressive strategy Nehemiah lays out. In Nehemiah 4:15 through 18 says, when our enemies heard that it was known to us that God had frustrated their plan, we all returned to the wall, each to his work. From that day on, half of my servants worked on construction and half held the spears, shields, bows, and coats of mail. And the leaders stood behind the whole house of Judah who were building on the wall. Those who carried burdens were loaded in such a way that each labored on the work with one hand and held his weapon with the other. And on each of the builders he had his sword strapped at his side while he built. The man who sounded the trumpet was beside me. Here Nehemiah says, we're not going to slow down the construction of the wall, but we're going to have a little strategy around this. There's going to be some of you that are going to hold the shields and the bows and the spears, and there's going to be some of you that are going to continue to work with both hands, and there's going to be some of you that work with one hand and hold a sword in it. Why? Because the threat was real. And they needed to be able to defend themselves. But you know what they didn't do? They didn't turn tail and run. But they stood together. They were committed to the completion of this project, even in the face of persecution. Even in the face of death. They were willing to continue with this mission. And Nehemiah was able to succeed in rallying these people together so they could stand together. And they stood together, continuing to build and complete the wall. Now in Nehemiah 6, verse 15 through 16, it says, so the wall was finished on the 25th day of the month of Elul, in 52 days. And when all our enemies heard of it, and all the nations around us were afraid and fell greatly in their own esteem, for they perceived that this work has been accomplished with the help of our God. You know what's interesting about this? With all the internal struggles, with all the external struggles, with all of the issues about who has what and who is who has food to eat and who has this and all that. they got it done. And they did it in 52 days. Now, I don't know how long construction takes in Tulsa, Oklahoma, but I can tell you in Harlingen, Texas, it takes more than 52 days to get a building permit. It takes a long time to do anything today, to build anything. Yet they were successfully able to take a wall that was crumbled, to remove the rubble, and to rebuild in 52 days. That shows what can be done when a team is working together, dedicated on a singular focus. Now, the wall was complete, but that is not the end of their story. You know, sometimes a congregation gets to a certain point and it says, hey, we've done what we needed to do. 2012, we ordained elders in Harlingen, Texas. And I can tell you, there was a moment in my mind when I said, whew, the job is finished. Set things in order. My job is done. But the reality is the work had just really started. We completed a task, but the job and the work continued. There was more to be done. And in the case of Nehemiah, they had successfully completed the wall around Jerusalem, but the work wasn't done. There were still things that needed to happen. So Nehemiah brings the people together. Just as he had turned and built his foundation of his decision on the Word of God, he called the people together to hear the Word of God. And Nehemiah chapter 8 verse 1 says, and all the people gathered as one man into the square before the water gate. And they told Ezra the scribe to bring the book of the law of Moses that the Lord had commanded Israel. So Ezra the priest brought the law before the assembly, both men and women and all who could understand what they heard on the first day of the 7th month. And he read from it facing the square before the water gate from early morning until midday in the presence of the men and women and those who could understand, and the ears of all the people were attentive to the book of the law. You know, these people had been dispersed. They were scattered. Yet they had an opportunity to be brought in and protected behind the walls of Jerusalem. But you know what Nehemiah didn't do? He didn't say, all right, guys, you got walls, you're good. He said, go to the law of God. Go to the commandments of God. Listen to the commandments of God. Why? Because Nehemiah knew what had caused Judah to fall away to start with. Their disobedience and God's people and their constant disobedience that led to their captivity and the destruction of Jerusalem. Or destruction of the temple, rather. So he said, go back to the Word. And these same people who had committed themselves to working on that wall lent their ear to the Lord. They were attentive to the book of the law. They wanted to hear the Word as instructed by God. In church this morning, turn to the Word of God. Be attentive to its precepts and teachings and let the Word of God guide your life. This congregation may grow and may flourish, but unless you will be attentive to God's Word, you may slip away. Don't let your spiritual wall crumble. You know, not only did they listen, but it says they committed themselves to it. Nehemiah reinstituted the covenant, and he made them state the words of the covenant that had been previously given. In Nehemiah chapter 10, verse 28 says, the rest of the people, the priests, the Levites, the gatekeepers, and the singers of the temple, and servants, and all who were separated, who have separated themselves from the people of the lands of the law to the law of God, their wives and their sons and their daughters, all who had knowledge and understanding, joined with their brothers and their nobles, and entered into a curse and an oath to walk in God's law that was given by Moses, the servant of God, and to observe and do all the commandments of the Lord our God and His rule and His statutes. Nehemiah said, hey, we need to go back to the covenant that was made through Moses, which was a continuation of the covenant that was given to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And this covenant was to commit themselves to the Lord, to His rule and His statutes. Sometimes churches grow, and in their growth, they lose sight of the truth. They lose sight of the standard. They lose sight of the law and the commandment of God. And they get excited about their growth to the point where they're no longer turning to God. They're turning to their own ideas and theories and processes. We can't do that. We got to stay committed to the law. Make a covenant with God that we're going to honor Him and serve Him before our own thoughts and ways. Now, the people followed the example in Nehemiah as well. You know, they rebuilt this city. It has walls, but it still needs to be occupied. These people had come from all these other lands. They'd come from all these other places to come and to work on this project. And he said, we're going to need 10% of you to stay behind and to live here and to move here. It says in verse 1, now the leaders of the people that lived in Jerusalem, the rest of the people cast lots to bring one out of 10 to live in Jerusalem, the holy city, while 9 out of 10 remained in the other towns. And the people blessed all the men who willingly offered to live in Jerusalem. They sacrificed. It says those that were willing, 10% of them stayed in Jerusalem. They made a long-term commitment for the cause of Christ. We are called, they did it for the cause of God. We are called to, in the like way, be committed for the cause of Christ. How committed are we? Are we willing to cast our lot in this congregation and say, I'm here, I'm committed, I'm going to work, I'm going to do what's needed, I'm not going to run the moment things get tough, I'm not going to go down the street if I get my feelings hurt? Or are we going to stay committed to the cause? Are we going to go all in? Nehemiah set that example, and those people honored that example with their commitment. After that, they dedicated the wall with great praise. And it's an interesting chapter in Nehemiah 12. It says in verse 27, it says, and all of the dedication of the wall of Jerusalem, they sought the Levites in all their places to bring them to Jerusalem to celebrate the dedication with gladness, with thanksgiving, and with singing, and with cymbals and harps and lyres. Verse 43, and they offered great sacrifices that day and rejoiced, for God had made them rejoice with great joy. The women and children who also rejoiced, and the joy of Jerusalem was heard far away. They praised God for this completed task. They praised God for the opportunity to continue to serve in Jerusalem and to live and to worship God and to follow His statutes and to honor Him with their lives. They praised God. And it says the joy of Jerusalem was heard far away. Do we praise our God? Now, I get it. We are in a enclosed structure. I don't know that the neighbors across the street can hear us. And I'm not saying that we in that exact same way are to blow off the roof so that all can hear us. But do we display that praise in our life? How often are we going out into this world without sharing and praising God for the success He is bringing to His church, to the work of His kingdom? They dedicated the wall with praise. The world heard it. And you can make an impact in the world. You say, well, I don't know how we in Tulsa. You can make an impact in the world. Not long ago, we had an opportunity to record a song in Harlingen, a Nigerian song that we sent to them. And we shared it on Facebook, but we sent it via WhatsApp. And many of those evangelists replied how they had shared it with the congregations they were worked with. And it brought them great joy. You know, we can praise God. We can show the world God's greatness. We may seem or think we're small, but we can do great things through the power of God. Now, Nehemiah 13 gives the final charge. You know, Nehemiah had served faithfully. His job was done. He had done what he was tasked to do, and he was headed back to Persia. And he lays out some final instructions to the people in Nehemiah 13, 1 through 3. And on that day they read from the book of Moses, and in hearing of the people, and in it was found written that no Amorite or Moabite should ever enter the assembly of God, for they did not meet the people of Israel with bread and water, but hired Balaam against them to curse them. Yet our God turned the curse into a blessing. As soon as the people heard the law, they separated from Israel all those of foreign descent. And this is Nehemiah's last words. He's saying, okay, this is my last instruction. And then Nehemiah goes home. He goes back to Persia. Guess what happens? They lived happily ever after, right? Nehemiah was successful. He was a great leader. They obviously continued to follow all of his instructions, right? Verse 7. Nehemiah comes back because there was problems already. They had rebuilt the walls. They were doing what God had said. They were following the instruction, yet not all was great. In Nehemiah 13, verse 7, it says, and came to Jerusalem, and then I then discovered the evil that Eliashib had done for Tobiah, preparing him a chamber in the courts of the house of God. Now remember who Tobiah was. He was not. He was, I believe it was Amorite. I hope I didn't mess that up. But he was not one of the Jews. Yet what was he doing? He was living in the house of God. And he had just been told not to do this. And who is it that gave him a room? The high priest. And I was very angry and threw all the household furniture of Tobiah out of the chamber. Then I gave orders and they cleansed the chambers, and I brought back there the vessels of the house of God with the grain offering and the frankincense. How quickly did they forget? How quickly did they go back to what was comfortable or right to their own eyes? But they dishonored God and they dishonored His law yet again. So what does Nehemiah do? He cleanses it again. And he says that he cleaned out the chambers and he brought back the vessels. But you know, that wasn't the only thing they did. In that short amount of time, they stopped tithing. They stopped giving their tithe to support the work of the priest. They stopped working, or they started working on the Sabbath. They started running the wine presses on Saturdays. They started marrying outsiders. So all the things that they just got done making a big commitment to God to do, how many things did they violate? Quickly, they violated. And you know, sometimes we find ourselves in that shape. We know what we ought to do. And as a congregation, we make firm commitments to honor the will of God. But secretly and privately, our hearts turn to what we want. And we don't do what God said. And we don't honor Him. But instead, we rebel against His orders and His instructions. Now, Nehemiah closes the book with a petition to God. Because at the end of the day, Nehemiah was just a man. And Nehemiah could serve with all his heart and he can do everything right. But at the end of the day, he can only do so much. And his judgment, the judgment that he is requesting of God, here in verse 30 says, thus I cleansed them from everything foreign, and I established the duties of the priests and Levites, each in his work. Then I provided for the wood offering and at appointed times, and for the first fruits. Remember me, O God, for good. And I can tell you, in church work, sometimes that last sentence is all I can say. Because you can't control what everybody else does. But you can control what you do. And you can control your commitment and your consistency to the work of the Lord. And you may find yourself discouraged because of the decisions of others. Maybe those that have been a part of this body that are no longer a part of this body. People that may have come and people that may have gone, just as I mentioned in my story. But at the end of the day, I can't control their decisions. But what I can do is my very best. And my final petition is, God, remember me for good. And that should be your petition. Honor God in your service. Honor God with the way that you conduct your life and the way that you teach and the way that you lead and the way that you work and the way that you serve. But at the end of the day, just say, remember me, O God, for good. Don't discard me, God, but remember me for good. And we can have the ultimate confidence because we know that our salvation is not based upon our works, but are based upon the blood that was shed by Christ. But being born again and redeemed by the blood of Christ has given us a family. And as a family, we have to serve and work with one another. As a team working hand in hand, we've got to lean in to support and encourage and help so that we can, as a congregation, be known for good. You see, God will make great things happen. If you will see the ruins of the world around you, you will weep for the broken. If you will pray without ceasing, if you will act boldly, build with others, defend with truth, and trust God to bring growth, God will establish the wall. God will rebuild what is broken. In this congregation today, you may feel that your wall is not complete. I do not know. But I will tell you, we will work together this week to establish any gap in that wall that we can help fill. And together, let's work to build according to God's design and plan.